Montana Territory, 1872. The vast prairie stretched before Heath Evans like an ocean of grass, rippling beneath the gray sky that threatened to unleash its burden any moment. At 25, Heath had already seen more of the harsh realities of the frontier than most men twice his age. His lean, muscular frame bore the evidence of years spent breaking horses and driving cattle across unforgiving terrain, yet his face remained youthful, high cheekbones, a strong jaw with light stubble, and eyes the color of summer sage that seemed to hold both wisdom and wariness. Heath believed one truth above all others: a man rode alone if he wanted to survive the frontier. Love was a luxury that got men killed. His father had loved his mother fiercely, and that love had blinded him to the dangers lurking in this untamed land. Heath had been just 14 when he watched outlaws gun down both his parents over a handful of gold dust and a prized horse. Since that day, he'd kept his heart as barren as winter plains. A man who lets others close gives fate too many chances to wound him, he often told himself while staring into campfires beneath countless Montana nights. What Heath wanted was simple: his own ranch someday, cattle that would answer to his brand, and the solitude that kept a man breathing on the frontier. What he told himself he didn't need were the complications of friendship, community, or, God forbid, the entanglements of romance. The West was no place for softness, not if you aimed to stay alive, yet something hollow had begun to form in his chest during the long winter nights, an emptiness he couldn't fill with work or whiskey. It haunted him like a phantom pain, this sense that survival alone wasn't quite living. But Heath Evans wasn't a man to dwell on such thoughts. He had cattle to move and a living to earn. The first fat raindrops began to fall as Heath urged his chestnut gelding toward Clearwater, a small settlement nestled against the foothills of the Rockies. The town had sprung up around a trading post 5 years earlier and now boasted a general store, a small hotel, a saloon, and a handful of modest homesteads. Heath rarely visited except for supplies and the occasional hot meal, but the approaching storm and the prospect of driving cattle through mud convinced him a night in town was the prudent choice. The heavens opened just as Heath reached the outskirts of Clearwater. Rain fell in sheets, turning the dirt road into slick mud that caused his horse to slow to a cautious walk. Thunder cracked overhead, and lightning illuminated the darkened landscape in brilliant flashes. It was through one such flash that Heath first saw her. A young woman stood beneath a large cottonwood tree near the bend in the road, her slender frame shaking with what appeared to be more than just the cold. Even through the downpour, Heath could see she wore a simple blue calico dress, now plastered to her body by the relentless rain. Her dark brown hair, escaped from its pins, hung in wet tendrils around her face. She couldn't have been more than 20, and she was weeping, her shoulders heaving with each sob. Heath nearly rode past. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. That was the code he lived by. But something, perhaps the vulnerability of her posture or the desolation that seemed to emanate from her, made him rein in his horse. "Miss," he called over the storm's fury, "you need assistance." She looked up, startled. Her face, despite being streaked with tears and rain, struck Heath with its beauty, delicate features, a small straight nose, and large eyes that even in the dim light appeared a deep violet blue. She quickly wiped at her cheeks, a futile gesture against the rain. "I'm quite all right," she called back, her voice betraying her words with a tremulous quality. "Just waiting for the storm to pass." Heath remained atop his horse, torn between his instinct to ride on and something deeper that kept him rooted to the spot. A flash of lightning revealed more, the slight swell of what appeared to be a growing belly beneath her dress and a small valise at her feet. This wasn't a local girl caught in unexpected weather, this was someone in trouble. Against his better judgment, Heath dismounted and approached, leading his horse. "You'll catch your death out here," he said, removing his slicker. "Town's just ahead, let me escort you somewhere dry." When she stepped back, wariness in her stance, Heath realized how he must appear: a strange man approaching a vulnerable woman on a deserted road. He stopped, respectfully keeping his distance. "I promise you're safe with me, miss. Heath Evans is my name. I work for the Double Creek Ranch south of here." She hesitated, then spoke. "Penelope Adler," she offered quietly. I arrived on today's stage, but my arrangements have fallen through. Something in her careful phrasing told Heath there was more to her story. The growing child she carried and the lack of a wedding ring suggested complications that had likely led to her current predicament. Well, Miss Adler, I can't leave you standing in this deluge. The hotel in town is modest but clean. Let me see you safely there. Another crack of thunder seemed to make the decision for her. Penelope nodded, reaching for her valise, but Heath was quicker. He grabbed the small bag and offered his arm for support against the slippery mud. As she placed her hand tentatively on his forearm, Heath felt something stir within him, an awareness he hadn't experienced in years. It unsettled him, and he quickly focused on the practical task of getting them both to shelter. They trudged through the downpour, the road growing treacherous with each passing minute. When Penelope slipped, Heath instinctively caught her, one strong arm circling her waist to steady her. Their eyes met briefly before both looked away, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy. Nearly there, Heath assured her, guiding his horse and the young woman around a particularly deep puddle. As they approached the small hotel, Penelope's steps slowed. I should tell you, she said, voice barely audible above the rain, I haven't much money. I don't know how long I can afford to stay. Heath glanced at her sideways. One problem at a time, Miss Adler. First, let's get you dry. Inside the hotel's modest lobby, they stood dripping on the worn carpet. The proprietor, Mrs. Winters, a stern woman in her 50s, eyed them with suspicion, her gaze lingering on Penelope's condition. We need a room for the lady, Heath said, reaching for his money clip. Heath, no, Penelope protested quietly. You don't have to. Just until the storm passes, he interrupted, placing coins on the counter. I'll take a room at the saloon. Mrs. Winters' expression softened slightly as she realized the nature of the arrangement. She handed Penelope a key. Room 3, top of the stairs. There's a stove you can light, and I'll send up some hot tea. Heath carried Penelope's valise upstairs, set it inside the small but clean room, and prepared to leave. At the doorway, he hesitated. Town's not big, but there's work to be found for those willing. The general store owner mentioned needing help, last I heard. Penelope stood in the center of the room, still dripping, looking lost and yet somehow determined. Thank you, Mr. Evans. I don't know why you stopped, but I'm grateful you did. Heath touched the brim of his hat. Get some rest, Miss Adler. Storm should pass by morning. As he turned to leave, he heard her quiet voice once more. Why did you stop? The question caught him off guard. Heath paused, searching for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much of himself. No decent man would leave a woman alone in such weather, he finally said, though they both sensed there was more to it than that. That night, lying on his rented bed at the saloon, Heath listened to the rain hammering the roof and thought of violet-blue eyes filled with tears. He told himself he'd done his duty, nothing more. Come morning, he'd continue on his way, drive the cattle back to Double Creek, and forget about Penelope Adler. But something had shifted inside him, like earth moving beneath his feet during a tremor. For the first time in years, Heath Evans had allowed himself to care about someone else's welfare. It was a dangerous crack in his carefully constructed defenses, one that both frightened and exhilarated him. Morning arrived with clearing skies and mud-slicked streets. Heath took breakfast at the hotel, telling himself it was merely convenient, not an excuse to check on the young woman he'd rescued. When Penelope entered the small dining room, he was struck by how different she looked in daylight. Her brown hair was neatly pinned back, revealing the elegant line of her neck. The blue dress, now dry, complemented her fair skin and brought out the extraordinary color of her eyes. Heath estimated her age at 20, perhaps 21, young, but with a composure that suggested she'd faced her share of hardships. Mr. Evans, she greeted him, surprise evident in her voice. I didn't expect to see you this morning. Heath stood, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Thought you might appreciate some company for breakfast. Unless you'd prefer solitude. A small smile touched her lips. Company would be welcome. As they ate, Heath learned that Penelope had traveled from Philadelphia, with promises of marriage from a man who had ventured west the previous year. Her letters had gone unanswered for months, but she'd already sold everything and purchased her ticket when she discovered her condition. With nowhere to turn in Philadelphia, her parents had disowned her upon learning of her situation. She had continued west, holding on to hope until arriving in Clearwater only to learn that her intended had married another just 2 weeks prior. "I should have known," she said, absently stirring her tea. "Thomas was always inconstant, but I believed what I wanted to believe." "What will you do now?" Heath asked, struck by her candor and lack of self-pity. "Find work, save money. Make a life for my child somehow." Her hand rested protectively on her stomach. "I won't return east. There's nothing for me there but judgment." Heath found himself admiring her resolve. Most women in her position would be broken, but Penelope Adler possessed a quiet strength that resonated with something in him. "I mentioned the general store," he said. "But there's also—" Miss Adler, a booming voice interrupted their conversation as a portly man with mutton-chop whiskers approached their table. "Forgive the intrusion, but I heard from Mrs. Winters about your situation." "I'm Dr. Samuel Jenkins." Penelope tensed. How much did Mrs. Winters share? The doctor's kind eyes crinkled. "Enough for me to know you might be interested in a proposition. My wife and I have been seeking help at our home. We need someone to assist with household duties and help care for our young children. The position includes room and board, modest wages, and," he glanced discreetly at her midsection, "understanding about your current circumstances." Hope flickered across Penelope's face. "That's very generous, doctor." "Purely selfish, I assure you. My wife is overwhelmed with our 4 little ones. Come by this afternoon if you're interested. We're just past the church." After the doctor left, Penelope turned to Heath, eyes bright with cautious optimism. "It seems fortune hasn't entirely abandoned me." Heath nodded, surprised by the conflicting emotions within him. He was glad for her good luck, yet somehow disappointed that her path forward no longer intersected with his. "The Jenkins family is well respected. You could do far worse." "And you, Mr. Evans? Where does your path lead today?" "Back to Double Creek. We're moving cattle to summer pasture soon." Heath hesitated, then added, "I come through Clearwater every few weeks for supplies." Something passed between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that despite their brief acquaintance, a connection had formed. Neither was prepared to examine it too closely. "Then perhaps our paths will cross again," Penelope said softly. Heath settled their breakfast bill and walked Penelope to the doctor's house afterward, carrying her valise despite her protests. At the white picket fence bordering the Jenkins' neat yard, they paused. "Thank you again, Mr. Evans, for everything." Heath shifted uncomfortably, unused to gratitude. "You take care, Miss Adler." As he mounted his horse and turned toward the trail leading out of town, Heath glanced back once to see Penelope watching him, one hand raised in farewell. The image stayed with him long after Clearwater disappeared behind him, a young woman with extraordinary courage, facing an uncertain future with her head held high. 3 weeks passed before Heath returned to Clearwater. He told himself his anticipation had nothing to do with a certain brown-haired woman with violet-blue eyes. The supply run was necessary, nothing more. Yet he found himself taking extra care with his appearance that morning, shaving closely and donning a clean shirt before riding into town. He spotted her immediately upon entering the general store. Penelope stood behind the counter, assisting an elderly woman with selecting fabric. Her pregnancy was more noticeable now, but she moved with grace, her face animated as she discussed patterns. When the bell above the door announced Heath's arrival, she glanced up, and the smile that illuminated her features sent an unexpected warmth through his chest. "Mr. Evans," she greeted him after finishing with her customer. "What a pleasant surprise." "Miss Adler," Heath removed his hat, suddenly aware of his dust-covered appearance after the long ride. "I see you found employment beyond the doctor's household." "Mrs. Jenkins introduced me to Mr. Thompson, the store owner. I work mornings here and afternoons helping with the Jenkins children. It's a good arrangement." She hesitated, then added, I've secured a small room behind the store as well. It's not much, but it will accommodate me and the baby when it arrives." Heath nodded, pleased by her progress yet unsure why it mattered so much to him. "Seems you've landed on your feet." Thanks in no small part to your kindness that night. Her eyes held his, sincere and warm. Something shifted in that moment, a recognition that the connection between them hadn't been severed by time or distance. Heath found himself accepting Mr. Thompson's invitation to supper that evening, an unprecedented departure from his usual habit of taking a quick meal at the saloon before heading back to the ranch. That evening, sitting in the Thompson family's modest dining room with Penelope across from him, Heath experienced something he hadn't known in years. The simple pleasure of belonging, however temporarily, to a circle of warmth and conversation. Mrs. Thompson fussed over him, insisting he take seconds of everything. Mr. Thompson discussed cattle prices and weather patterns with the ease of a man who served as the hub of local information. And Penelope, she watched Heath with quiet interest, drawing him into conversation with gentle questions about ranch life. After supper, with the Thompsons tactfully occupying themselves in the kitchen, Heath and Penelope stepped onto the small porch behind the store. Twilight painted the western sky in streaks of orange and purple, while the first stars appeared overhead. "Will you return to Philadelphia after the baby comes?" Heath asked, the question that had been nagging at him all evening. Penelope shook her head. "There's nothing for me there, and despite how I arrived here, I find I'm growing fond of Clearwater." She glanced at him. "It's strange how life unfolds, isn't it? 3 weeks ago, I was standing in the rain believing my world had ended. Now, I find myself building something new." Heath nodded, understanding perfectly. Sometimes the path we imagine for ourselves isn't the one we're meant to travel. "And what of your path, Mr. Evans? Does it ever lead toward something beyond work and solitude?" The directness of her question startled him. "I've found it safer to rely on myself," he admitted. "Attachments on the frontier can be costly." "Yet you stopped for a stranger in the rain," she pointed out softly. Heath had no answer for that contradiction. Instead, he changed the subject, telling her about the upcoming cattle drive that would keep him away for nearly 2 months. If disappointment flickered in her eyes at this news, he told himself it was merely the dimming light. "I should go," he said finally. "Early start tomorrow." "Of course," Penelope stepped back toward the doorway. "Safe travels, Mr. Evans." On impulse, Heath reached for her hand, holding it briefly. "Heath," he corrected. "My friends call me Heath." Her smile in response was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then I shall look forward to your return." "Heath." Those words echoed in his mind throughout the long weeks of the cattle drive. Heath found himself calculating dates, estimating when he might reasonably return to Clearwater. The men he worked with noticed the change in him, a distraction, a tendency to stare thoughtfully at the horizon in the direction of town. "Got a girl waitin' somewhere, Evans?" Thomas Rawlins, a seasoned drover, asked one night around the campfire. "No," Heath answered automatically, then paused. "Not exactly." Rawlins chuckled. "That's how it starts. Next thing you know, you're pickin' out curtains and nammin' babies." Heath scowled, but the older man's words lingered. Was that what was happening? Was he, against all his carefully constructed defenses, developing feelings for Penelope Adler? The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. By the time Heath returned to Clearwater in late July, summer had transformed the landscape. Fields of wildflowers surrounded the town, and the cottonwoods along the creek shimmered with full foliage. Heath found himself urging his horse faster as the settlement came into view, anticipation building in his chest. His first stop was the general store, but disappointment awaited him there. Mr. Thompson informed him that Penelope had begun her confinement at the Jenkins household 2 weeks earlier, the baby expected any day. "Doctor thought it best she stay there, what with her condition and all," Thompson explained. "Said to tell you she's doing fine if you happen by." The fact that she had left a message, specifically for him, caused a surge of emotion Heath wasn't prepared to examine. He nodded his thanks and continued with his purchases, trying to focus on practicalities rather than his unreasonable desire to ride straight to the doctor's home. That night at the saloon, Heath nursed a whiskey while half listening to local gossip. His thoughts kept drifting to Penelope, wondering about her welfare, hoping the birth would go smoothly. He'd seen too many women lost in childbirth on the frontier, a reality that now filled him with dread. "Evans," a voice broke through his reverie. Dr. Jenkins stood at the saloon entrance, eyes scanning the room until they landed on Heath. "Thought I might find you here." Heath stood, alarm coursing through him. "Is something wrong with Miss Adler?" A smile broke across the doctor's face. "Quite the contrary. She delivered a healthy baby girl not 2 hours ago. Mother and child are doing splendidly." Relief washed over Heath with such force that he had to grip the table for support. That's good news." "She's been asking for you," Jenkins added, watching Heath's reaction carefully. "Seemed certain you'd return around this time." Heath hesitated only briefly before grabbing his hat. "Lead the way, Doc." The Jenkins household was quiet when they arrived, the children presumably asleep. Mrs. Jenkins, a plump, kind-faced woman, greeted Heath with knowing eyes and led him upstairs to a small bedroom at the back of the house. "She's tired, of course," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, "but she insisted on seeing you if you came." Heath removed his hat, suddenly aware of his dust-covered clothing and unshaven face. "Perhaps I should return tomorrow when—" "Nonsense, Mrs." Jenkins interrupted, already opening the door. "She'll rest easier for seeing you." The room was dim, lit only by a small lamp beside the bed. Penelope reclined against pillows, her face pale but radiant, dark hair loose around her shoulders. In her arms lay a tiny bundle wrapped in white linen. "Heath," she said softly, his name on her lips sounding like a homecoming. He approached the bed carefully, as though approaching a newborn fawn that might startle. "Miss Adler. I hear congratulations are in order." "Penelope, please," she corrected gently. "After all we've shared, formality seems unnecessary." She shifted the bundle in her arms. "Would you like to meet her?" Heath moved closer, peering down at the infant. A perfect, tiny face with delicate features and a whisper of dark hair greeted him. Something powerful and unexpected swelled in his chest, a protectiveness, a tenderness he'd never experienced. "She's beautiful," he said, voice rough with emotion. "What have you named her?" "Hannah," Penelope replied. "It means grace. Something I've found unexpectedly since arriving here." Heath nodded, unable to tear his gaze from the child. "It suits her." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sound Hannah's soft breathing. Finally, Penelope spoke again, her voice hesitant. "I wasn't certain you would return." Heath looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "I told you I would." "Men have made promises to me before," she said simply. The implicit comparison to the man who had abandoned her stung, but Heath recognized the fear behind her words. "I'm not him, Penelope." "No," she agreed, studying his face. "You're not." "That's why I waited." The weight of her statement hung between them, an admission that she had placed hope in his return in him. It terrified Heath even as it filled him with a strange joy. "I should let you rest," he said, standing. "I'll call again tomorrow, if that's acceptable." Penelope nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'd like that very much." True to his word, Heath returned the following day, and the next, and the day after that. He extended his stay in Clearwater far beyond what was necessary for ranch business, finding excuses to remain in town. Each day, he spent hours at the Jenkins household, watching as Penelope grew stronger, as Hannah began to show hints of her mother's features. On the 5th day, as they sat together in the small garden behind the house, Hannah sleeping peacefully in a basket beside them, Penelope turned to Heath with determination in her eyes. "You've been very kind to us, Heath, but I must ask, why? What keeps you in Clearwater when your responsibilities lie elsewhere?" Heath stared at his hands, calloused from years of rope and reins. The question demanded honesty he wasn't sure he was ready to give. "I find myself reluctant to leave," he admitted finally. "Because of pity," her voice was steady but vulnerable. "No, Heath met her gaze directly. Because when I'm away from here, from you, something's missing. It's as though, he struggled for words, unaccustomed to articulating feelings. It's as though I've found something I didn't know I was looking for. Penelope's eyes softened. And what happens when you return to your ranch, when the pull of your solitary life reclaims you? It was the question Heath had been asking himself for days. The life he'd built, the safety of emotional isolation, could he truly consider abandoning it? And for what, a woman with a complicated past and a child not his own? Yet when he looked at Penelope with her quiet strength and gentle heart, when he gazed at little Hannah, something fundamental shifted inside him. The barriers he'd constructed after his parents' deaths began to crumble, revealing a truth he could no longer deny. His carefully maintained solitude wasn't safety, it was a prison of his own making. I don't have all the answers, he said honestly, but I know that leaving becomes harder each day. Penelope reached across the space between them, her fingers lightly touching his. Then perhaps you shouldn't leave just yet. That touch, simple, tentative, sealed something between them. Heath felt it like a brand upon his heart, both frightening and exhilarating. The next 2 weeks passed in a haze of new experiences. Heath found himself integrated into the rhythm of Penelope's days, holding Hannah while Penelope rested, accompanying them on short walks as her strength returned, sharing meals and quiet conversations that stretched late into the evening. With each passing day, the thought of returning to his solitary existence at Double Creek became more unbearable. Yet reality couldn't be held at bay forever. A telegram arrived from the ranch foreman, requesting Heath's immediate return for the fall roundup. As he stood on the Jenkins porch that evening, telegram crushed in his fist, Heath felt the weight of decision pressing down upon him. Bad news. Penelope asked, joining him with Hannah cradled against her shoulder. I'm needed back at the ranch, he said, unable to keep the conflict from his voice. Penelope nodded, disappointment evident in her eyes despite her attempt to hide it. Of course, you've already stayed far longer than you intended. Heath turned to her, suddenly desperate to make her understand. Penelope, these past weeks have been lovely, she finished for him, and I'm grateful for every moment. Hannah and I both are. It's more than that, Heath insisted, stepping closer. I've never felt, he broke off, frustrated by his inability to express the tumult of emotions within him. Penelope saved him from his struggle with quiet dignity. You don't owe me explanations, Heath. You've been kinder than I had any right to expect from a stranger who found me crying in the rain. Her words, meant to release him, instead crystallized everything Heath had been feeling. He reached for her free hand, holding it firmly. I don't want to leave, he confessed, but I have responsibilities, men counting on me. I need time to arrange things. Hope flickered in Penelope's eyes. What are you saying, Heath? I'm saying that I'll return, not just to visit, but, he took a deep breath. I'm asking if you would wait for me, properly this time, with a promise you can count on. Tears welled in her eyes. Are you certain? My situation, Hannah, is part of who you are, Heath finished, and I find I've grown to care deeply for both of you. It wasn't quite a declaration of love, neither was ready for those words, but it was a commitment nonetheless. A promise that the connection between them deserved the chance to grow. The following morning, as Heath prepared to depart, Penelope and Hannah stood on the Jenkins porch to see him off. Heath kissed the baby's forehead, then with uncharacteristic boldness, leaned forward to place a gentle kiss on Penelope's cheek. 3 weeks, he promised. I'll return in 3 weeks with more to discuss about our future. Penelope nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. We'll be waiting. As Heath rode away, he felt lighter than he had in years, despite the uncertainty ahead. The protective walls he'd built around his heart had begun to crumble, replaced by something far more valuable, hope. The 3 weeks at Double Creek passed in a blur of activity as Heath negotiated with the ranch owner, arranged for his replacement, and prepared for a significant change in his circumstances. The men he'd worked alongside for years watched with knowing smiles as he packed his belongings and squared away his affairs. Never thought I'd see the day, the foreman commented. Heath Evans settling down. Heath merely nodded, surprising himself with how right the decision felt. The fear of loss that had governed his life for so long now seemed less powerful than the promise of what he might gain. When he finally rode back toward Clearwater, autumn had painted the landscape in golds and reds. The air carried a crispness that hinted at the winter to come. Heath's mind raced with plans and possibilities, his usual caution replaced by an uncharacteristic optimism. That optimism shattered the moment he entered town. A somber atmosphere hung over Clearwater. Black bunting decorated several storefronts, and people spoke in hushed tones as Heath passed. A terrible foreboding gripped him as he urged his horse toward the Jenkins residence. Dr. Jenkins met him at the door, his usually jovial face grave. "Heath, my boy. You've come back." "What's happened?" Heath demanded, fear clutching at his throat. "Where are Penelope and Hannah?" The doctor placed a steadying hand on Heath's shoulder. "There was a fever that swept through town last week. Vicious thing. We lost 3 souls to it." Heath felt the blood drain from his face. "Penelope." "She's alive," Jenkins assured him quickly. "But it was a close call. She's still very weak." "And Hannah?" The doctor's expression told Heath everything before he spoke. "I'm sorry, son. The little one was too fragile to fight such a virulent illness. We did everything we could." The world seemed to tilt beneath Heath's feet. Hannah, tiny, perfect Hannah with her mother's features gone. And Penelope, the woman who had somehow broken through years of carefully constructed defenses, clinging to life. "Take me to her," he managed to say through numb lips. Jenkins led him upstairs to the same room where Heath had first seen Penelope with her newborn daughter. The contrast between that joyful moment and the present was devastating. Penelope lay pale and still against the pillows, her once vibrant form diminished by illness and grief. "She refuses to eat," Mrs. Jenkins whispered as they entered. "Won't speak. It's as though she's given up." Heath approached the bed slowly, his heart breaking at the sight of Penelope's vacant expression as she stared out the window. Her beautiful hair lay limp around her shoulders, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. "Penelope," he said softly, taking her cold hand in his. She turned slowly, as if the movement required tremendous effort. Recognition flickered in her eyes, followed immediately by a wave of pain so intense that Heath felt it like a physical blow. "Heath," she whispered, voice cracked from disuse, "you came back." "Of course I did, I promised." A single tear slid down her cheek. "She's gone, my beautiful Hannah is gone." Heath sat carefully on the edge of the bed, still holding her hand. "I know, I'm so sorry I wasn't here. It happened so fast. One day she had a slight cough, the next." Her voice broke. "Why did this happen? What purpose could it possibly serve?" The age-old question of suffering, one Heath had asked himself after his parents' deaths, hung between them. He had no adequate answer, only the truth of his own experience. "There's no purpose in such loss," he said honestly. "Only what we choose to do afterward." "And what would you have me choose?" Penelope asked, a hint of bitterness in her tone. "To simply continue as though my heart hasn't been torn from my chest." Heath understood her anger, had lived it himself. But he also knew what lay beyond it if one could endure the journey. "I would have you choose life," he said quietly. "Not today, perhaps, not tomorrow, but someday." Penelope turned away, fresh tears streaming down her face. "I'm not sure I know how anymore." Heath stayed with her throughout the day and into the evening, sometimes talking softly about inconsequential things, sometimes sitting in silence. When Mrs. Jenkins brought food, he gently coaxed Penelope to eat a few bites. As darkness fell, he read to her from a book of poetry he'd found on her bedside table. It became a pattern in the days that followed. Heath moved into the small room behind the general store that had been Penelope's, visiting her from dawn until the Jenkins politely sent him home each night. Slowly, incrementally, he saw signs of life returning to her, a question asked, a brief smile at something he said, more food consumed at each meal. A week after his return, Heath wheeled a chair onto the Jenkins porch and, despite her weak protests, carried Penelope downstairs to sit in the autumn sunshine. The color that touched her cheeks in the fresh air gave him hope. "I came back with a plan, you know," he told her as they watched leaves drift from the cottonwood trees. "I've left Double Creek." This roused her interest. "Left, but your position there." "Was just a job," Heath finished. "I've saved enough over the years to make a start elsewhere." "Where will you go?" Penelope asked, and Heath heard the unspoken question beneath her words. "Will you still go now that everything has changed?" "That depends," he said carefully. "My original plan included a woman and a child I've grown to care for deeply. The child is now with the angels, but the woman," he took her hand, "the woman is still here, still in my heart." Penelope's eyes filled with tears. "Heath, I'm broken. The life you imagined with me, it's gone." "No," Heath said firmly. "Different perhaps, marked by sadness, yes, but not gone unless you choose to make it so." "How can you still want this, want me, after everything?" Heath considered his answer carefully, knowing its importance. "Because loss is part of loving on the frontier. I learned that with my parents. I tried to protect myself by staying alone, but all I did was ensure I had nothing worth fighting for." He squeezed her hand. "You gave me something worth fighting for, Penelope, you and Hannah." "Hannah is gone," she whispered, pain lacing her words. "Yes," Heath acknowledged, "and we'll carry that grief. But it doesn't mean we can't also carry joy in time." It was the most he'd ever revealed of himself, of the philosophy that had slowly formed during his vigil at her bedside. The belief that life could contain both profound loss and profound happiness, sometimes simultaneously. Penelope didn't answer immediately. Instead, she turned her face toward the warmth of the sun, eyes closed, tears drying on her cheeks. When she finally spoke, her voice held a new quality, not happiness, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile tendril of acceptance. "What was your plan, before?" Heath told her then about the small homestead he'd found 30 miles west, nestled in a valley with good water and fertile soil. How he'd already made a down payment with his savings, planning to build a proper house before winter set in. "It's not much yet," he admitted, "but it could be something with time and work." "A home." Penelope listened, a distant look in her eyes as though seeing the place he described. "It sounds peaceful." "It is," Heath hesitated, then added, "the offer still stands, Penelope, not right away. You need time to heal, to grieve properly. But when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a place for you there, with me." She turned to him then, studying his face with an intensity that made him hold his breath. "Why, Heath? Why would you take on a woman with such sorrow?" "Because some burdens are easier shared," he answered simply. "And because the thought of returning to my solitary existence after knowing you is unbearable." It wasn't quite a declaration of love, that would come later when the wounds were less raw, but it was an honest expression of his feelings, his intentions, his hopes. Penelope's recovery continued through October and into November. Each day brought small improvements, longer walks, more animated conversations, moments when grief receded enough to allow glimpses of the woman Heath had come to care for. He divided his time between Clearwater and his new property, building a modest cabin and preparing for winter. On a clear, cold day in late November, Penelope asked to visit Hannah's grave for the first time since the funeral she'd been too ill to attend. Heath supported her across the small cemetery to the tiny marker beneath an old oak tree. They stood together in silence, Heath's arm around Penelope's waist as she leaned against him for both physical and emotional support. After several minutes she spoke, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, surprising him, "about the homestead." Heath held his breath, afraid to hope. "And Hannah will always be part of me," Penelope continued. "My first child, my beautiful girl." She placed a small bouquet of dried wildflowers at the base of the marker. "But I can't stay frozen in grief forever." "She wouldn't want that." "No," Heath agreed softly, "she wouldn't." Penelope turned in his arms, looking up at him with eyes that held both sorrow and resolve. "I'm not whole yet. I may never be entirely whole again. But if you're willing to accept that, to accept me as I am now, then yes. I would like to build something new with you." Joy surged through Heath, tempered by the solemnity of the moment and their surroundings. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle. "I accept you exactly as you are, Penelope, every part." That evening, seated before the fire in the Jenkins parlor, they made plans. They would marry quietly before Christmas. Penelope would continue working at the general store until spring while Heath completed essential work on the homestead. By the time the wildflowers bloomed again, they would begin their life together properly. "It won't be easy," Heath warned. "Frontier life is hard in the best of circumstances." Penelope's smile held a new determination. "I'm stronger than I appear, Heath Evans. I've survived the unsurvivable. I can certainly handle a few frontier challenges." On Christmas Eve, 1872, Heath and Penelope were married in Clearwater's small church. The ceremony was simple, attended by the Jenkins family, the Thompsons, and a handful of townspeople who had come to care for the young woman with the sad eyes and quiet dignity. Penelope wore a dress of deep blue velvet, her hair adorned with a single white ribbon. As Heath stood beside her, reciting vows of protection and faithfulness, he marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment, from a rain-soaked encounter to a shared future, from mutual loneliness to the promise of companionship. Winter passed in a rhythm of work and preparation. Heath divided his time between improving the homestead and visiting Clearwater, where Penelope continued working while preparing for their new life together. Each visit showed Heath more of her resilience as she gradually emerged from the depths of grief, not forgetting but learning to live alongside her loss. When spring finally arrived, melting snow and bringing new growth to the Montana landscape, Heath arrived in Clearwater with a wagon to collect his bride and her belongings. The town turned out to bid them farewell, a testament to how deeply Penelope had integrated into the community during her short time there. As they drove away, Penelope made one request: to stop at the cemetery. There she placed fresh wildflowers on Hannah's grave and whispered a private goodbye. "She'll always be with us," Heath assured her as they returned to the wagon, "part of our story." Penelope nodded, wiping away tears but smiling through them. "Yes, the beginning of our story, not the end." The homestead looked its best as they approached, wildflowers carpeting the meadow, the cabin Heath had built sturdy and welcoming with smoke curling from the chimney. He had hired a local woman to prepare the interior, and as Heath carried Penelope across the threshold, she gasped at the simple but thoughtful touches. Curtains at the windows, a colorful quilt on the bed, shelves for her books. "Welcome home," Heath said softly, setting her on her feet. Penelope turned in a slow circle, taking in the cabin that would be their beginning. When she faced Heath again, her eyes held something he hadn't seen in months. Joy uncomplicated and bright. "It's perfect," she said, stepping into his arms. That night, as they lay together for the first time as husband and wife, Heath finally spoke the words that had been growing in his heart since that rainy evening nearly a year before. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "I think I've loved you since I found you crying in the rain." Penelope raised herself on one elbow to look into his eyes, her own shining with emotion. "And I love you, Heath Evans. For finding me, for waiting, for showing me that life continues even after unimaginable loss." 1 year later, on a warm spring afternoon, Heath returned from checking fence lines to find Penelope sitting in a rocking chair on their expanded porch, singing softly to the infant in her arms. Their son, barely 2 months old, had his father's green eyes and his mother's determined expression. Heath paused at the edge of their property, taking in the scene: the thriving garden, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the woman who had taught him that loving deeply was worth the risk of loss. The family he'd never imagined having. As if sensing his presence, Penelope looked up and smiled, the simple gesture still able to quicken his heart after all they'd shared. Heath removed his hat and walked toward his future, each step carrying him further from the solitary man he'd once been. "Welcome home," Penelope called, the words a reminder of all they'd built together from that chance encounter in the rain. Heath climbed the porch steps and bent to kiss first his son's forehead, then his wife's lips. "It's good to be home." And it was, this place they'd created together, where grief and joy coexisted, where the past was honored but not permitted to overshadow the present, where love had proven stronger than the harshest frontier trials. In the distance, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising spring rain. But this time, there was no fear in the approaching weather, only the promise of renewal, of growth, of life continuing its eternal cycle in the vast Montana wilderness they now called home.